Hello and welcome to this short research interview with Stephen Wilson, Hannah Grayson and Charlotte Baker. Dr. Charlotte Baker is a senior lecturer at Lancaster in French and Francophone studies, and she's here to speak to us about her current research project funded by the AHRC. And this is in light of our own research initiative, Languages of Disease in the Contemporary Francophone World, which builds on the premise that humanities have an important role to play in making sense of disease. And it looks to examine some of the forms of cultural representation which express and interrogate experiences of illness, wellness, pandemic, recovery, amongst others. In this project, we're engaging with the Francophone world in its largest sense and looking at texts, languages, and discourses to examine culturally specific understandings of disease, as well as the roles of translation and testimony. So Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to be hearing from you today, particularly because we think there's lots of crossover with your own work and our project aims. So we're just going to ask 4 questions. And the first is that you've worked on disability and stigma in your work in sub-Saharan Africa for a large part of your career. And from what I know, there's been a particular focus on cultural representations of albinism. So could you tell us a bit about your work in this field up until this point, and then how that led to your current AHRC funded project?
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me to speak with you. And it's true, there are lots of interesting intersections. So I became interested in albinism through the work of the Francophone Guinean writer William Sassine, who I discovered during my master's dissertation. And I decided to explore literary and cultural representations of albinism in my PhD thesis. But I was looking at purely literary and cultural representations, and it was in that period, 2006, 2007, when these reports started to emerge of human rights abuses against people with albinism who were being attacked for their body parts in Tanzania. And I just couldn't ignore this issue and continue to work only on representation. I felt that more needed to be done in terms of albinism. So I decided to focus on the issues that I felt were underpinning these attacks, and actually which had been expressed in some of the literary works that I'd looked at, which concerned the understandings of albinism and the beliefs attached to it in African contexts. So I had some funding from the Wellcome Trust as I started my academic career. In 2013 and 2015, I had small grants that enabled me to build an Albinism in Africa network. And we organised a series of events, including a really great conference in Cameroon that brought together experts on albinism. And these were academics, but they were also policymakers, NGOs, albinism organisations and support groups, medical and education professionals as well. We really began a truly interdisciplinary discussion around albinism. It was a sharing of expertise, but we were working together to try and enhance understandings and think about how we worked with communities, but also worked at a higher level with policymakers to make a difference. So the discussions we had especially at the event in Cameroon, really brought together different stakeholders into that kind of very productive exchange. And in a way, my current AHRC project is an extension of that work. It's in the same vein. It's not focused purely on albinism, but my main collaborator on this project is Dr. Elvis Imafidon, who is currently at SOAS, but was previously at Ambrose Ali University in Nigeria. And we're working with colleagues at universities of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and at the Université de Yaoundé in Cameroon. And the Disabilities Project, it takes a wider perspective on the drivers for particular understandings of disability in African contexts. So different types of beliefs that are attached to disability and their impact on people, on disabled people, as well as on their communities. So in a way, we're extending our interest in albinism further by looking in a more comparative way at it. But at the same time, we're taking some of the learning from that work on albinism and trying to apply it more broadly in terms of building networks and collaborations, thinking about the different types of organisations we work with. And also thinking about all the different influences on the experiences of people living with various disabilities.
Thanks so much. So obvious crossovers with our broader interest in disease and illness and wellness and the things, languages, belief systems that shape those. I forgot to ask, could you give the title of the project?
Yeah, so the AHRC project is called Alternative Explanations, Disability and Inclusion in Africa.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlotte. So as you know, in our project, what we're seeking to do is to think about some of the ways in which disease is culturally and linguistically framed in the Francophone world, including in Africa, where much of your own research has focused in recent years. Now, you're looking at disability, and you're looking particularly, as I understand it, at alternative explanations for disability, including traditional belief systems and religious beliefs and medical determinism and supernatural or witchcraft related beliefs. Just in terms of those connections that Hannah spoke about a moment ago, could you maybe tell us something a little bit about the role of language in your research to date, specifically the language that you've come across in literature and community engagement and some other sources that have revealed to you in your project something of these understandings of disability?
Thank you. Yes, that's a really good question, because certainly the framing of disability and ways in which it's explained has underlined how individuals combine different beliefs or understandings of the causes of disability. So, for example, they'll suggest a medical explanation in addition to a traditional explanation rooted in animism, for example. With albinism, we often find people do understand the genetic roots for the condition, the genetic cause of the condition, but they will explain it as a curse or as the result of someone's misdemeanor and a punishment for that. So we're keen to understand, as part of our project, the ways in which disability is expressed in local languages. We're not simply working in French and English. And I think to do that, we have to work closely with disabled persons organisations, DPOs in the countries that we're working in, and where we're hoping to undertake our field work next year. A major driver for our project is that in the academic literature, the language used to talk about disability in the global south is often rooted in disability theories or approaches developed in the global north. And it's quite removed from the realities of disabled people in Africa, for example. And this is problematic, of course. But also, disabled people are not adequately represented in these discourses of development or in academic work on disability. And this is something that we felt strongly has to change. And the makeup of our project team and our engagement with disabled scholars and DPOs is an attempt to sort of take a small step towards changing this. Another of our objectives is to support Africa-based academics to take a lead in disability studies on the continent. So we're hoping to build a network of disability studies scholars across Africa that we hope in time will start to shift these discourses of disability in the spheres of academia, but in turn in the spheres of development. So just to give one example, we're running a postgraduate webinar next week where we have almost 20 speakers, I think, who are coming, all postgraduate students who are working on disability in the global south. And these are the scholars of the future. And so, you know, supporting them through this project and their work and also enabling this kind of exchange, I think, will be fruitful in future. But I've been struck by the language that I've come across that's been used by organisations and even some scholars as being remarkably ableist language, reproducing labels attached to disability or health conditions, albeit with often the best intentions. And disabled persons organisations are really starting to push back against this now and to present their own narratives of disability. But I think we all have to be very conscious of the language that we're using in our own work as well as academics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, the approach that you take there about sort of driving down to a very local level and look at these very local individual languages of disability is certainly something that we'll be seeking to replicate as we begin to study disease in the Francophone world as well. Thanks so much.
Charlotte, one of the main drivers for myself and Stephen in our own project has been seeing the brilliant expansion and establishment of the medical humanities in the Anglophone academic sphere in the last sort of decade or so, and feeling that as we look towards the Francophone sphere, there isn't perhaps that same momentum or sort of collaborative umbrella for this kind of study. And one thing we want to do is build bridges between the two. And obviously your project is working, as well as in other languages, right across the Anglophone and Francophone spheres. And so I was wondering if you could maybe pull out for us some of the commonalities or differences you find in working across those spheres, both in the scholarly world, but also in the world of applied practice. With some of your stakeholders. And then secondly, what so far are some of the challenges you're finding of working with those languages, between them, across them, and then drawing in those other languages that you mentioned as well?
Well, I think my work initially was very much rooted in the Francophone sphere, and then I've worked increasingly comparatively across the Francophone and the Anglophone. And it struck me over the years that there is relatively little engagement still between academics working comparatively across Francophone and Anglophone contexts. There was a real surge in interest in disability studies in France after the 2005 Loi Handicap, and this led to increased critical interest in disability. But disability studies doesn't really exist in the same way in France, and this is something that Hannah Thompson picks up in her article in French Studies in 2017. That's not to say that there aren't scholars working in this area in France and in the Francophone world, but often they're based in discipline-specific departments. So my colleagues on this project, they're based in theatre studies or in sociology and social work or in philosophy, rather than in disability studies, as they might be in the UK. So here we've got a lot of interdisciplinary departments and research centres that are focused on disability. This really still doesn't seem to be the case for French-speaking or Francophone world universities. Just turning to the challenges, I think for me, one of the major challenges of working across French and English is just that many of the terms associated with health and illness and disability just don't translate very easily. So disability studies in itself translates rather problematically as les études sur le handicap. And then in my own work on albinism, the term albino in English is considered a very discriminatory label by Anglophone scholars, and the term person with albinism is preferred, putting the person before the condition. But in French, the term is albinos, and this continues to present a stumbling block in our work across linguistic boundaries with regards to albinism research specifically. And then, of course, I think one thing we have to confront with working in these languages in African contexts is the colonial legacy and how that can create barriers to engagement. And this is why our African partners are so important in our current project, and as they were in the albinism work that we did before, whether these are academic partners, DPOs, NGOs, or local community groups. We have to make sure that they're working with us collaboratively, and that we try and achieve these equitable working arrangements in our engagement with local communities as well.
Yeah, that reminds me of Alison Phipps' work on multilingualism and the principle of English last, and how in a focus group or workshop that can be put into practice, and the work that's required to do that, but the rich kind of engagement that comes out of it. Yeah, and I think those challenges, we identify the same thing in our project, really. And on a good day, I see them as invitations to get into the nitty gritty of translation. And, one of the things we're so fascinated in is this articulation of the experience of illness from multiple perspectives. And, that will require looking at these terms in detail and how, what they're representing, what people are articulating in different ways in different languages. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Thank you.
And one of the reasons why we were very keen, Charlotte, for you to be our first interviewee in this series for this project is that both Hannah and I are really inspired by the way in which both this project you're doing at the moment, but also so much of your work in recent years has been sort of focused on the impact of your scholarly work on communities and the different groups of people, including on policymakers. So we just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about the ways in which you're working with different groups of people at the minute through this Disability and Inclusion Africa project. Could you tell us about some of the organisations that you're working with and how that goes in terms of applying your scholarly research to those specific contexts?
Thank you. Yeah, so we're working with many different types of organisations, and in a way the project's bigger than the project should be. When we look at, it's a relatively small research grant in terms of the money, but actually I see it as a beginning, a new beginning really for this work, and something that hopefully we can build on in years to come. So our research team is made up of academics across Africa and in the UK, but all who are engaged in interdisciplinary work related to disability, the arts and humanities. So I'm based in modern languages. My colleagues, as I say, are in philosophy, sociology and social work, creative writing and theatre studies, and based in universities across Africa. And while our project is embedded in academic research, these colleagues' interest in disability often extends beyond an academic interest as well. My work on albinism led me to understand that we also need to engage with communities from the very outset. And so in scoping this project, we were already beginning to identify partner organisations that we could collaborate with and their representatives. And I think we need to be grounding our work in the experience and expertise that's already there in these communities. So we're working with local DPOs, we're working with community groups and local NGOs, small NGOs, undertaking field work in partnership with them. Often they open doors to enable us to access the communities we'd like to work with, but also engaging in collaborative research that's of mutual interest and benefit, and also holding a series of in-country workshops. We also need to be working, I think, with policymakers from the outset, and the funding that I have is a Global Challenges Research Fund, and so that determines that we need to be engaging in development and discourse of development. However uncomfortable that might feel at times from an academic perspective. So that means that we need to know what evidence they need to bring about change, and we need to work with them to ensure that our work can have an impact even before we start doing it. And the organisations concerned here then are international NGOs, development organisations like DFID, for example, Oxfam, international organisations as well, such as the UN. And again, some of the relationships that we've drawn on here are existing relationships from previous work that we've done. But what I've also found is that these different organisations often don't speak to one another. And so one of my roles as an academic has actually been in sort of joining the dots and building relationships and bringing people together either through networks or through events so that there's a better understanding of the issue at hand. And there's a story I often tell, which is again focused on albinism, but albinism support groups in Africa have a lot of expertise and understanding that they can share with the people that are actually tasked with working to support them. So medical doctors, for example, often only see a person with albinism in their surgery, and they see them, as a person with a particular medical condition that needs treatment, but they don't understand the wider socio-cultural context that shapes these people's lives. And so if we can open the lines of communication between these different groups, then there's a lot of understanding to be gained on different sides. So in terms of impact, I think our current project aims to have impact on different levels, to highlight the impact of alternative understandings of disability on disabled people and those who work with them. So we're trying to enhance understandings of particular and shared experiences of disability. Often we find that scholars or NGOs or organisations work on a single disability or work on a single context. And again, we're trying to sort of break down those boundaries by bringing people together into more comparative discussions. We also want to enhance disability studies work in Africa, building connections between academics working in disability studies, and also transforming the way in which Africa-based academics work together with other experts, whether these are based in disability organisations or NGOs. And we want to use this understanding then to shape approaches to the inclusion of disabled people in international development. And I think probably is the last thing to say, our work's very much grounded in the arts and humanities, and it's funded by the AHRC, so of course there's an interest in this aspect. We're interested in the role of the arts in communicating these alternative explanations and bringing about social change. So the arts enable disabled people to develop a disability identity, to assert their sense of self, to challenge stigma by expressing an alternative identity and sort of embrace their embodiment. And I think forms of art and culture can place the emphasis on commonalities and actually enable connections to be made with other marginalised groups and to promote agency. So, you know, in a way, the arts can be used for broader social transformation, but they can also be used for education and advocacy. So we're putting together an exhibition at the moment, which has turned into a virtual exhibition on our website, but it illustrates how the arts can be used by NGOs and organisations working in country to change people's attitudes towards disability of different sorts. And we also want to look at the tools that the arts and humanities can offer us, including modern languages, from my perspective, in addressing the issues associated with disability. And the last thing, I suppose, in terms of the legacy of the project, we'd like this network of Africa-based disability experts to be established during the project, but to allow for a continued sharing of practice after the lifetime of the project. And we hope that will then underpin any future work that we do in this area.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you speak so passionately about these aims, which are really powerful and really significant aims of the project. And I was actually just going to jump in there and ask you about the legacy of it. You know, what you'd like to see coming out of this in 2-3 years after the project. So I'm really glad you addressed that at the end there of your contribution. So thank you so much for being with us today. We're absolutely delighted that you are the first guest as part of this project. We hope to, in the coming weeks and months, we hope to be engaging with other people, perhaps recording some other interviews before we have our workshop together in February of next year. So thank you for all of your contribution today, because I think some of the frameworks that you give us there and some of the conceptual ideas that you give us there are things with which we will want to engage in our project as well. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the IMLR, the Institute for Modern Languages Research in London, for funding this project and for hosting this video and the project today. And finally, just to say on behalf of all of us here that if anyone is watching this at the minute and you're particularly interested in these questions and this project that Hannah and I are leading, you'd be very welcome to get in touch with both of us by email, please, and we'd be delighted to hear from you and see how we can engage with as many people as possible as we build to the workshop in February. So thank you very much.